Hello, this is our Policy 202 lecture on conditionality. So today we're going to kind of talk about some background PF assumptions. We're going to go through some other lectures. We'll talk about some background for conditionality. We'll talk about time skew, strategy skew, and other core standards. We'll talk about dispositionality. We'll go through some key tips, and then we'll go through 1ARs, 2NRs, and sort of 2ARs. So let's go ahead and begin. With PF assumptions is pretty relatively simple. You should take all the theory you learned in PF and then just sort of take the LV parts out of it. And so basically that sort of limits the scope of arguments you can give. And so interpretations kind of have to be reasonable, so you're not going to get blue highlighting only or must disclose all interps or things like that. You must have reasonable standards, so your impacts generally need to terminalize into education or fairness through sort of like a community norm or model type argument. You need to have sort of actual voters, so reject arg versus team is a very important distinction, and it's pretty much for a lot of judges, certain arguments are always reject arguments, will never not be reject arguments. And so it doesn't matter even if the opponent said and conceded it was reject the team. If the judge thinks it's always reject the argument, you're never getting past that baseline. And so the limits to kind of just condo or disclosure theory. And so let's go ahead and from there, other theory you can kind of use is our topicality lecture. You should know interp, violation, standards, voters, some of those ins and outs and those basic sort of background and tips and things like that. Let's talk about worlds versus strategies. So conditionality in a nutshell. And so conditionality in a nutshell. So first of all, you got to count up the number of strategies you might have in a 1NC, and then you got to count up the number of worlds you might have in a 1NC. So basically a strategy is going to exclude procedurals. So it doesn't matter if I'm reading 1, 2, 3 topicality or disclosure arguments. Those are not worlds. Those are procedurals. They come prior to any type of policymaking decision. Strategies includes procedurals. So that might be 3 strategies right there, 3 different topicalities, but it is 0 worlds. So for example, if you have 1 topicality, an open source, 2 disads, 2 counterplans, a K, the case, this could be basically 3 worlds plus the status quo. But it might be 6 strategies or permutations with the disad and stuff. And so ultimately, worlds is just based on number of worlds, so competing counterplans or critique alternatives. And so that would be 3 additional worlds in the example I gave. The basic rationale between the differences is there's different time skew differences between counterplans, critiques versus those other positions, and there might be different policymaker decisions and distinctions between those other positions and fundamentally the off case. Now, one tricky thing to note, and this always kind of costs someone around here or there, is that worlds may include the status quo depending upon your definition. So when I said that above example, instead of 3 worlds, that could be 4 worlds including the status quo, because the status quo is technically a world. And so this is pretty much a trivial distinction. There's no 100% community consensus here. Whether, reading a K, a counterplan, the status quo is at 2 or 3 worlds really. It's kind of 2 independent worlds from the status quo, but the status quo is kind of a dependent world itself. So, in that situation, it's almost like trivial to tomato type thing, and just kind of as long as you're specific when asked and clear whether you include it or exclude it, it's usually a pretty, irrelevant type of distinction. So let's go through the fundamental reason that counterplans are sort of different or critique alternatives are different, but I'm going to kind of go through this under the K on the counterplan side of things. It's relatively the same for critique alternatives, but I'm just going to simplify it, go through it in this lens. So let's start with disad. So in a disad, the 1NC has to be complete. Debate norms consider complete uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. Now remember, they generally just consider 1 level of uniqueness required. You don't have to read uniqueness for each level of those link chains in the 1NC to be complete. Vice versa, you don't have to read impact calculus in the 1NC to be complete. And so that's kind of where the norms have shifted to allow and what it is. The 2AC then has to answer each of those parts equally. So we have an equal reciprocal time trade-off, right? 1NC versus 2AC. But then they also can choose to start impact calculus, read causation cards, etc. That might be additional time spent. Or they can read non-uniques on core parts of that link chain that the 1NC never read uniqueness for, but they're going to contest a different part of it and prompt, a neg block response on that uniqueness. And so that's kind of the 2AC. These have to spend a little bit more time on the disad than the neg spent, but it's not too much. On the counterplan, it's a little bit different. So on the counterplan, the general norm, you just have to read a text. Solvency, hopefully. Now, again, some very neg-leaning judge might just say solvency is logical and you don't have to actually read that in the 1NC, but most will require some sort of carded evidence before the AF must be, held to answer it. And there must be, either an internal net benefit or an external net benefit clearly defined. And so that general three components of a 1NC, the 2AC can answer each of those. So they could answer the solvency, right? They could answer the internal net benefits. Now they still have to read theory in addition to this. They then have to read perms in addition to this. Now remember, the neg doesn't have to start with theory and why they're legit. They just have to answer specific theory. Vice versa, they have to make specific deficits to kind of answer those solvency. That might not be general counterplan fails, but might not be doesn't solve this component of AF. So that's a whole nother line of carded responses. They have to read specific disads to the counterplan. They have to make arguments that the counterplan links to external net benefits that may exist or don't solve their internal net benefit very well. They have to answer the implicit uniqueness for each level of the link chain on the net benefit because there's no real uniqueness read on any part of it. They then also might have to start impact calculus on the net benefit, reading causation cards and things like that. And so it's almost like the worst of all worlds in that the general requirement of the 2AC on average is to spend more time answering the counterplans than the neg has to read in the 1NC. Just more time, that's kind of the cost there. Now, fundamentally, this gets us to an issue where, the app's going to say you get just one counterplan. And that might be a situation where, the app's always going to be much better on case because they got 8 minutes of case. And all that time spent on case might mean they destroy that one counterplan. And so now the app's winning too much because we've limited it to just, one counterplan. And so we need kind of more than one counterplan, but vice versa, we don't want an infinite number of counterplans because that's what got us in a situation in the first place where if you read 8 or 9 counterplans that are all diverse with limited cross applications and test different components of, 1AC resolutional burdens, things like that, then you're going to have a situation where the debate kind of gets broken, the AF misses something on one of them, and it's not really a substantive debate, but becomes sort of a game of whack-a-mole. And then the neg is winning far too much. And so some sort of middle ground is generally the time skew you want to kind of sell with your interpretation, or at least a reasonable path toward that middle ground, and kind of frame it around that ideal world. And so with that, this kind of gets us to interpretations. Like your middle ground is that interpretations. And so the obscure end on one side would be, infinite worlds. The extreme neg counterinterp that's sort of always implicit is that we can always do whatever. That might be millions in worlds, whatever, add to infinity with combo planks and things like that, and kicking planks for 10 advantage plank counterplans. That would be one that is something that is, one extreme. The next sort of level you might end up getting is just sort of, what we did, so we get what we justify. Which is going to be just sort of, count the number of worlds we actually read this round. That's our number we're going to defend. Not more, not less. You can kind of debate us on that debate. Further next level of interps, usually, the AF response is your number of worlds of -1. So you said we get 6 worlds, and we said 6 is too much, let's just do 5. We can capture all the benefits through 5. You don't really need that 6, and that 6 might just be just enough to push us over the brink and get us in some of this, the time skew type situation where adding up the benefit eventually gets the neg ahead over the inherent AF advantage because they have the 1AC in case. And so that's kind of the next level of interpretation. You might then go down to sort of the bottom where the negs or af are just like you only get two. And so you get one counter plan, one K, and then the status quo, right? And so that could be a scenario to kind of capture a little bit of K education claims. So you're not forced into just the counter plan or a critique. You can get a little bit of both worlds. Plus you get the status quo. That seems fair, reasonable middle ground. You'll see a lot of teams coalesce to that. Vice versa, you might also sort of see the world of you get just one world. So you get that, one counter plan or one critique. And it might even be unconditional world. So if you say one counter plan or one critique, you're stuck to that. No status quo. And so that's kind of the ultimate extreme of we get one thing, we get to pick, you get one, you start with the status quo. If you don't want it, you get to jump ship once, but there are no takebacks. And so that sort of like reciprocal 1v1 is kind of the basis of that sort of unconditionality challenge. Now both extremes, like, infinite condo, unconditional seem, that's where that Goldilocks comes in, and you ultimately want to find a middle ground. And, fundamentally debating that middle ground is a little bit hard to do. And so one thing to kind of think about from here, and we'll talk about dispositionality in a second, but that's kind of the other sort of interpretation that kind of deal with all of this as well. What about procedurals, right? Procedurals, well, we talked about disads, procedurals. You have an interp violation standards voters. The 2AC generally has to answer all those. There's other some sort of interesting things too with procedurals. There's a limited number of topic worlds, so there's like more of a cap on them than maybe off-case spam, disads, things like that. Although there are caps on those given strategies, cross apps. You have other cross apps between definitions and mooting words of resolutions and limiting case lists and things like that, as well with different topicalities. You also have sort of reasonability and just sort of judge bias on sort of yes-no questions on violations and other sort of reasonable, biases that creep in to make topicality an uphill battle. And so all of those kind of make it to where maybe there's not as much of time skew with more procedurals on the AF. So if you're answering time skew in your neg, generally you want to think about what are sort of the AF skews they get generally, whether there's a lot of AFs, limits, topic is large, structural alt causes with time skew, 1AC, 1AR norms, 2AR making new arguments up, cross applications that always are going to exist and limit and be strategic, multiple procedurals if they might still be somewhat damaging and you can always get there some way, or other inherent AF biases that you might look at from topic data or things like that. And so these are things that you kind of want to use globally to respond to this. And generally control the framing that whatever your offense is going to be a much larger and more important thing than a little bit of time skew here or there. The next level of sort of standard is strategy skew. So the strategy skew argument's a little bit more complex than time skew. Time skew just says the more you do because I have to put more basic responses, and if I don't put one of those responses, I've dropped it and I can't make it later. I have more minimum I have to put in response than it takes you minimum to read it. That time skew gets multiplied the number of worlds. This is less of that and says the worlds can have sort of strategic implications that limit the types of AF responses they can make. And so, we'll start with the sort of baseline everyone should be familiar with, the basic double turn. The neg reads an econ DA and they read DDev on case. And so the econ DA says growth is good. DDev on case says growth is bad. Obvious double turn. AF gets up, concedes the double turn, does weighing, wins the debate relative to the status quo. And so this is kind of the baseline scenario everyone should be familiar with in a, non-world-based debate. Now when we start to add worlds and conditionality, things can kind of have twists or turns. And so one is, the neg can kind of get away with double turns. And so one example, the neg reads a regneg counterplan. So consult businesses with a econ, bizcon, internal net benefit. And then they also DDev on case your econ advantage. And so you can't really concede the DDev argument and say the counterplan solves econ more, thus vote AF, because they can kick the counterplan because the net benefit just links to the counterplan. It doesn't link to the plan. And now there's nothing left and you've conceded DDev and you've lost the debate. And vice versa, all the sort of DDev, econ, growth goods, stuff like that you put on case, basically means you're going to have to concede a lot of those warrants that can be used against you to sort of concede and control the debate on the BizCon internal net benefit that you otherwise would otherwise make other defensive answers you've now lost access to. And so that's something that is, limited you strategically to put you in a bind. And that strategic limitation is one form of strategy skew that's kind of made it a rigged game for the negative. Other sort of scenarios. So another one is like disadds to counterplans. Back to red neg. And, instead of internal net benefit, we just have like a normal politics external net benefits. Where consulting businesses takes less political capital because they feel included. And then we read a cap K as well. And so the normal world would be, concede the cap K, that's direct, takes out the reg neg counterplan. Oh, can't really do this. I can't also read my, we already talked about that above. I also can't read my disadd of the counterplan about corporate takeover. When we consult the businesses, they're going to manipulate the plan and cause it to turn into a bad thing, because that basic link analysis is going to be used by the neg against me when they go for the cap K, saying, yes, you're right, it's all going to be manipulated. You think you get around it, you don't. Here's all these reasons, and it's fundamentally limited my ability to want to read these disadds or no solvency arguments to the counterplan, because the warrants, while they apply much more to the counterplan, they apply a little bit to me, and that's enough to kind of be used with another off-case position to kind of form a decent risk of link type scenario. And so that is also sort of strategically limited the arguments I can make. Another scenario you might get is like impact turns. And so two random process impact turns with opposite internal net benefits. One says democracy good, one says democracy bad. That has nothing to do with democracy. You can't really get up and call the bluff and try to impact turn one of the internals, because if you do, they can just sort of kick that counterplan, go for the other one, and now they've used all that impact turn framing against you to kind of just win risk of internal solvency, and then they're in a good spot because, you've read 3 or 4 scenarios against them that go to extinction. And so this is something that's limited your ability to impact turn, because they can always kind of get around it by having another counterplan that solves it more. That because they're inherently conditional and they're contradictory. And so the strategy skew fundamentally comes from inherent contradictions between arguments that seem like they're double turns, but because of the conditional nature, the neg can kind of pivot out of it, and then you can't really execute the double turn against them, so to speak, because they can just shift the debate of what they defend. So if you're, neg and you're answering strategy skew, the basic kind of ways to deal with this is, of course, try to limit your in-round performance contradictions. So if you're not doing any of this, and there's very limited ones that are not super strategic or easy to kind of answer if you're AF anyway, it's not the end of the world. You have other ways to kind of beat the arg. If you can control that framing, do that, or use a counterinterpret to exclude all these sort of extreme examples they're giving that's going to happen, and say that's not us, not we allow. Vice versa, you can kind of always use neg flex as your package disadd to kind of weigh or outweigh this and say, yes, this is bad, but this is what the neg calls neg innovation or neg geniusness. And so we should prefer that type of critical thinking because it's smart and, it's, forwarding the best policy option or helping the neg win the most and rebalance inherent AF structural biases. And so you can always repackage this as a good thing is one way to kind of think about it. You can also think about whether their interpretation, whether it's just n-1, does it really solve the strategy skew, or can they still do it with 3 worlds even if they don't have 4? Does that make it irrelevant to strategy skew and neither world can solve it, and the one less world is not going to really make a big difference? Vice versa, how does DISPO play into this? Does DISPO resolve it or just rebalance it too far the other way? And that's something to kind of think about from a strategy perspective. The performative contradictions ultimately might be good as well educationally. So testing from multiple angles could be the best policy making. It could be force critical thinking. It could be ultimately necessary for better sort of revolutionary testing or identity formation or things like that. And you can engage it substantively with cards as well and kind of weigh that educational standard as a reason why it's good to have strategy skew to kind of make you think or to kind of test these things from these different sort of influx positions. And so realistically, the strategy skew is almost its own separate standard. A lot of the times, a lot of neg standards are really just time skew in disguise. But you can kind of flex both and kind of weigh both as independent ways that independently hurt your ability to win the debate or be fair, because they've either tilted the arguments you can make against them or they've tilted your time against them. Both have kind of, if you have less time, you don't make the arguments you need to win. If you just can't make those arguments, then you can't make those arguments. Both ways kind of get into a too far of a neg ballot, and that's kind of how you weigh a fairness claim from there. Beyond that, neg flex is generally the primary disad that you want to kind of weigh against this. Now, you can think of this as the neg needs more worlds to win fairly. The AF is winning too much now. We need to be able to test from multiple angles to be able to have that fair shot to win. If we're down to just one world, that Goldilocks is not quite there. It's a little bit further. And so think about it as just controlling that Goldilocks and saying that's where we need to get to the sort of best balance. And that requires a little bit more neg flex on the number of worlds to get there because of bang, 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 all these sort of AF sort of, structural biases, topic biases, standards, things like that you can play out. Vice versa, when things go downhill, you can always use this as sort of like an impact turn to the AF standards. Yes, they're winning all of this. This destroys the AF's ground here, but that's actually a good thing because we're controlling the larger global neg flex claim. And to sort of use that as sort of a tilt. Like, yes, we might balance it to like 70% neg, but it's already 80% AF, and it's better to go that way to get closer to the 50-50 than it is their way that they're proposing. That type of framing can be super, super important, and you can kind of just use neg flex as almost an impact turn to their standard when push comes to shove, if you're kind of, when you have that full speech to kind of give, or if it's been conceded. And so that's kind of the bread and butter for condo debater as a neg, is you're going to kind of control this type of thing, about what are those various structural topic based, the data, what it says, what happened in this round type things, and compare all of these to the interp necessary to kind of establish what the good, number of worlds and strategy conditions are on those worlds. If you're kind of answering it, now remember, you want to do the opposite. You want to control afflex, talk about the opposite structural biases, in-round abuse, topic biases, data from tournament results, things like that, to kind of establish where you think that current uniqueness is right now and who's winning too much. And then thus it would be better to kind of punish the neg and get to more of an aff-favorited world to kind of limit some of this counterplan slop. Again, this is fundamentally about finding that Goldilocks and sending that your vision of the topic is closer to it than theirs, which is where the counter-interp versus interp is a very important debate, and all sort of standards need to be specific to that comparison and not just sort of talk in vague about infinite condo versus no condo. It needs to be specific to their number versus your number or your condition. Which is why that's ultimately super, super important. Whether you're talking in-round specific data of what's going on in tournament elims or specific standards relative to your interp, all super important over sort of generalized, just reading off the blocks type debating. One other thing we need to talk about is logic, of course. Now, there's a cult of people that definitely live by this, and so the general idea is conditionality is logical. There's different flavors of this, and sometimes you'll see them scurrying like rats between the flavors, but most of them, and at least the better ones, sort of generally fall into 2 or 3 of them rather than just sort of jump to all of them. And so we'll go through just sort of all of them in sort of a random order almost. And so one, they might say it's logical to test a proposal from multiple angles. You're trying to find the best possible proposal. This is like a negation theory argument. And so, the common response to this is, this is ultimately a neg always wins theory argument because it is too negative biased to ultimately say you can test it from any angle. And we have limitations on that called, mutual exclusivity, competes through net benefits, other things like that if we can establish norms of debatability to limit it, there's no reason why conditionality can't do the same. Vice versa, you might hear something like it's logical to test between competing policy proposals, right? And so it's a very similar to the one above, but it's like best policymaker type justification for logic. And for this, again, policymakers don't care about debate. They don't care about mutual exclusivity. They don't really, they put plan plus rider stuff all the time. They don't evaluate absurd neg disads or the set call K or the minerals topicality. And so realistically, debate isn't about policymaking, where it's about sort of establishing sort of a fair adjudicative standard to promote good pedagogical education and research practices and knowledge about the world in a fair and sort of, equitable manner. And so this is one in where you kind of just have to control the response to that. Another one you're going to kind of see, and this one's kind of the more popular one, is that it's sort of logical to always be able to revert to the status quo at any time. We always start with the status quo. We might propose another option, but if that option burns down, we should at least always be able to go to the status quo, and that sort of implicitly justifies multiple options to jump to, and then be able to jump back to the status quo, because we're sort of testing these things, and it's just sort of logical to kind of test if we're neg. The AF doesn't test, we test. Now again, a lot of this one's very sort of tautological. The idea that they are always defending the status quo and they didn't leave it originally when they picked the world. All of this is sort of like an implicit assumption on their part, and you generally want to just frame debatability outweighs as the cleaner way to kind of approach this. You might hear also it's logical to defend any position outside the resolution. The AF is jurisdictionally to vote to affirm the topic. The neg is to negate the topic. The neg is outside the topic. So we get everything outside the topic. Now, the easy answer to this is tab ballots don't say for topic. They say for team. And so you just vote for the team who does the better debating. So ironically, or, jurisdictionally, jurisdiction has been eliminated from debate. Alternatively, you might see the flavor of this. It's the extreme opposite. It's logical. If the AF gets one plan, the neg should only get one counterplan. And this is almost like a reciprocal-based warrant. Now, Kondo kind of disproves this because it's inherently not reciprocal just with more than one world or even the status quo plus a world. But obviously, beyond that, debate's not super reciprocal, based on topic burdens, burdens of proof, stock issues, exact times, neg block versus 1AR, norms of who has to prove violations versus we meets, prep inequities between AF and neg, all sorts of stuff exists a lot more, and it proves debate's just really not reciprocal. So realistically, if you're answering logic, you kind of want to point out the fundamental tautology that goes behind a lot of this, and it's almost like an empty reasoning that says it's more logical, and sort of the realized almost the best version of this that closely escapes this tautology is one that kind of jumps to a 2-in-R judge kick. We should always get to revert to the status quo type warrant. So even if you win Kondo, you might take out all the counter plans, but I at least get status quo versus disad and can beat you there. And while that might balance like the 10 worlds go away, but there's still the status quo. But if those 10 worlds strategically prevent you from making certain arguments on case that cause you to lose the status quo, that could be implicated, or just the time skew causes you to drop a turn or not to be able to read 3 cards on a disad hidden on case and you just read 1 and then they just out tech you in the block because of it. The time skew does implicate case accordingly. And so, that's something, is debatable as well. And so ultimately you're going to be going for almost a debatability outweighs argument that your standard is more educational, better research, and forces better debate if there is no judge kick and they could have to pick a world and not force the fundamental justification against 2-in-R conditionality is that it basically disincentivizes theory 2ARs because they have to both win theory to disprove the counterplan or perm disprove the counterplan, and then they have to beat case/external net benefit. And so that's a 50-50 split, whereas they could just not go for theory, spend all the time on case, external net benefit, maybe win that more. They're incentivized to do that, never incentivized to go for that theory route, which encourages less competitive theory arguments. Because they're going to be very hesitant because they have to only 3 minutes to win it. Whereas if it's a TKO thing, then if they win theory, beat the counterplan, it goes away. Then the counterplan that's very cheaty, the 2AR can just spend all 5 minutes, drop case, drop the external net benefit, and say, once I've beaten the counterplan, they have lost the debate on theory, and you're voting AF right there because there is no judge kick. And so it kind of forces, or if there's a disad to counterplan route that you're going and saying that outweighs the net benefit, they can't just kick the counterplan and go for the net benefit. That would be sort of the substantive way it sort of executes. But either way, the judge kick argument kind of forces sort of a more in-depth and less strategically or theory-averse 2-in-R, because they have to be always present of the 5 minutes bluff where they just call it and go all in on theory and beat you on theory. And so that's a sort of self-limiting check to kind of limit the scope of counterplans is if you sort of reject judge kick and require, the 2-in-R to kind of make a choice. It also just makes judging a lot easier if there's just sort of one thing to compare about and not all these permutations between worlds and does it really link or not and to what degree, and uniqueness, what happens with uniqueness if the counterplan provides it or does the status quo have it, and when you kick the counterplan, what happens there. And so all these things kind of get, go away or left or never get resolved by the debaters because there's only 5 minutes and are just sort of empty things that just make the debate outside the debate. And if you just picked in the last speeches, it would be solved. Anyway, judge kick rant over. Let's go ahead and jump to dispositionality. So dispositionality is another sort of alternative counterinterp. Sometimes negs will just say it to defend it as their interp to kind of call the bluff or say, I feel comfortable in this theory debate. But for the most part, this is an AF interp. And so the AF interp is generally going to be as follows, that we can force you into one world. You can have as infinite number of conditional counterplans as you want. So you can read those 8 random counterplans / k-alts. But in any speech, I could basically reduce you to one of those counterplans or k-alts. And the way I do it is by on that one sheet of paper, not making a perm or theory argument. And so if I just make either solvency arguments, this adds to the counterplan k-alt, make an impact term the net benefit, I could do some sort of substantive answer to the argument only. And I say it's theoretically legit and I'm not going to perm it. Every other world goes away and it's sort of like I've called poker all in. This is it. Let's have this debate. And so let's kind of like talk about what that looks like in a little bit more detail. So here is sort of a baseline scenario where you have a 1MC that has 2 counterplans, 2 critiques, a topicality, a status quo, 2 disads, right? One of the disads is both a net benefit to one of the counterplans and the status quo, whereas the other disad's only a net benefit to the status quo. And so everything in the world of normal conditionality, the neg can kind of go for anything. They got free ride over anything. In the world of dispositionality, so let's say they decide to call the bluff. So, if they don't call the bluff, it looks like this baseline scenario that I've already given, that they just make a normal speech just like conditionality, put all their responses. They've said, let's just do a normal debate. But say they want to call the bluff on strategy B. They researched strategy B, found this was a terrible idea. Lots of authors said it's going to cause all these bad things. And they said, oh, you know what? Let's go ahead and do it. And so on a dispositional world, strategy B, they've decided to say we are not going to perm or read theory on this. Because of that, they still have to perm and read theory on the other arguments. Now, they don't need to read like global lots of theories. They just need to go real quick and say perm do CP on each of the other positions or perm do K-alt on each of the other positions, right? Now, in the basic world in which they decided the counterplan's a bad idea, they're conceding the counterplan solves case. So they don't really need to answer case anymore. They don't really have to worry about disads that link to case because they're not, the counterplan also solves case. All they really have to worry about is procedural arguments that come first. And then they get to read all their disads to counterplans, weighing all that stuff right there and say, let's have the debate. Here are 3 new DAs. And we're going to do this, and then I'm going to read my answers to your net benefit, which is your one sort of advantage. We've almost flipped the debate and said, let's do this. That's world 1. That's the most gutsy world. Another common world you're going to get to sort of the case world, where I don't really have a bunch of disads to counterplans, but I know this counterplan's a terrible idea. It's not actually going to solve my AF at all. And so instead, I'm going to still not perm or read theory on it. So I'm going to do my perms on everything else. I'm going to answer the net benefit, of course. I've proved the counterplan is not going to solve, so it's not going to solve my case. I still have to answer the theory of the argument, so the procedural arguments, so topicality. I still have to go to case and answer the case arguments because I'm trying to weigh my solvency deficit in case, and if I have no case, there's no solvency deficit. And on various off case, I got to kind of make sure it links to the counterplan. It's not really a net benefit, right? There's no differential there. It's not based on solvency. It's based on something else the counterplan does that links equally. And so if I've covered my bases there, sometimes I have to cover my bases as well and other stuff we'll talk about. But for the most part, that's the simplest call. I've just added case to the debate. And so it's a little bit bigger, but now I get my 8 minutes of case and I can clearly just win a solvency deficit and outweigh their silly net benefit. So you can kind of see how this kind of restructures the debate dramatically. On each of the other positions, I've just said perm. I don't have to read cards. I don't have to read link terms. I don't have to read, impacts takeouts. I don't have to read answers to net benefit. I don't have to read a whole bunch of non-uniques. All I have to do is say perm, and then the world goes away. And then it's like a non-unique disad, doesn't really matter, probably links to the counterplan too equally. And so no real differential, the debates on the counterplan that we've stuck them to. And so you're able to kind of save up all that time that they're trying to skew you, of that inherent, you have to spend more time answering it. And you basically called their bluff and said, I don't have to make those answers. I've actually saved time because it takes no time for me to say perm do CP. And instead, on the one counterplan, I have put all my time there and research there, and that's where I'm going to now have a huge time advantage relative to the neg block. So the way this kind of goes from an offense-defense perspective is, neg is, you say dispo, they say they're not, and you say you should be dispo. Usually in the 1AR, you have education-based offense. That's going to be in the line of, without, in the world of dispositional, the neg's only going to read counterplans if they're substantially researched, because they have to prepare for that bluff call when they read 3 disads to the counterplans or a bunch of no solvency arguments. They can't just kick it and go for one of the other 5 counterplans. They have to be prepared enough on the debate that they can have that debate regardless of what the AF reads if the AF calls the bluff. And that sort of limits proliferation-wise, causes depth over breadth in research. And this sort of depth over breadth is almost an educational claim. It could be a fairness, education claim, it could be a fairness claim because there's less to research, less research burdens, more reciprocal, that type of thing. But fundamentally, it's about sort of limiting the number of options that the negative can sort of spam out there. But still, this can have offense within a fairness framework, right? Obviously, this can have time skew offense because it rebalances the 2AC because they could call the bluff, save all the time they were going to lose on the off case. They had to read all those extra answers, now just perm, so they sort of rebalance the time skew or flip it. Vice versa, strat skew, that we know now we can concede when it's a contradiction. I can concede and punish them for it because now force them into the counterplan that links more to the cap K or links more to the politics disad, right? And so you can sort of punish them for these sort of turns, and that could be fundamentally one in which that would almost strategically add a more nuanced element or innovation to AF strategy in addition to neg strategy. And so that's one in where you can put turns with dispo in each of these, but fundamentally you're usually going to start with education is your offense, education outweighs, and then you have sort of defense to their various fairness-based standards. So let's talk about some twist with dispo. So one big twist with dispo is, it might not happen in the 2AC, it might happen in the 1AR, right? 1AR is, the block goes for a bunch of worlds. 1AR says this is too much. They collapse. They pick a world. In the 2AC, they tested with theory and perms just because they wanted to get the long perm to CP block, long intrinsic perm block. But in the 1AR, they concede not to do that. They think they got you on a solvency deficit. They extend that. They extend case. They then extend defense to the net benefit. And they've now kicked, a counterplan and critique that were extended as well. And fundamentally, those are non-unique. They link to your counterplan too. And now they've rebalanced the debate into what was going to be a minute 15 spent on position. They've now spent 3:30 on the position, and you're in trouble. And so that's something to always be aware about is the collapse might not, it rarely happens in the 2AR, but it could happen in 2AR too, but it's rarely the more gutsy one is 2AC or 1AR. Another sort of big twist to think about is what happens, and this is a very common one the neg kind of gets you on, is you go for a solvency deficit, and you're going for the solvency deficit in case, not realizing one of the disads to the topic DA's read actually link based on solvency. They don't link on, proposal of plan. So while you've conceded the counterplan gets rolled back, right? And that's what you're going for. Counterplan doesn't become law. Now the topic disad is about the actual implementation of the plan being bad for Russia. And you now drop the Russia disad because you try to stick them with the counterplan and saying, haha, you proposed the plan too. You obviously link to the Russia DA. But because of this own solvency deficit you make on case, it could be a time frame deficit, it could be IE delay, it could be just like a rollback argument, a circumvention argument, a perception arg, whatever. Now they don't link to the disad either. And the disad just links to the plan and you drop the disad and you're in trouble. Because now a new net benefit is sort of materialized. And so that's something always to be wary about if you're an AF going down the solvency route is how does the various topic DAs, do they link purely to the counterplan or do they require solvency to kind of get a link and then it's kind of going to be in trouble? Other things to kind of think about twist-wise is different definitions of what dispositionality means. And so, there's obviously the right definition, which is kind of how I described it. It has to be one position. But other things to kind of think about is, can you make dispo bad? Does that count as theory? Some minority of judges might say that you can't make perms or that counterplan is bad, but you're always welcome to make dispo bad because it's a global theory argument. And you can still stick them to the counterplan within that. as like a even under your world, we can stick you type thing. Some say no, any theory counts, and that's kind of more the norm. You have to kind of give up even dispo bad if you're going to call this bluff. Can the AF force multiple contradictory counterplans? So, for example, can they not perm two counterplans that are the opposite? Say they both happen at once, ban the government and do a reg-neg with the government, and say that contradiction causes political infighting, war, whatever, confusion, hurts the economy. Can you do that under dispo? And so the wrong way dispo says yes, and that's why dispo makes no sense. The right answer is no, you can only dispo one sheet of paper. And so you can basically only do that for one sheet of paper. And so in the world where the app does it for two, it would be kind of up to the neg to pick which one they want to kind of go for. And so they wouldn't have to, worry about both. They would just get to pick one, and that's the one we'd say the AF called the bluff. And because the AF tried calling it on two, it's sort of the AF making a mistake and saying, here are my two options. And rather than punish the neg and make them defend both, they sort of punish the AF for doing it improperly and let the neg pick which one they want to do. And that's kind of the neg one would have to answer all that sort of bluff world, and they can disregard the other one. So it's sort of like a conditionality neg flex fixed that Goldilocks standard. Can you get judge kick? Now again, some judges will say even under dispo, there's judge kick. So you stuck them to that counterplan. You can beat that counterplan, gets rid of all the other counterplans in the 2AC, but because of logic, because of policy making, because of jurisdiction, because of whatever, they always get the status quo. And they can kick that counterplan when you read your 6 disads to it. Say you didn't go for case, and I'm just going to go for external net benefit now. That was a net benefit to the counterplan. You're in trouble. Or topic disad that you dropped. And so under that world of judge kick, that could kind of infiltrate dispo and make it more conditionality light rather than a judge that would say, no, dispo, if they've called the bluff, it makes no sense for the neg to be able to get out of that bluff on the counterplan research to just kick it and go for topic disads. The app did all these things pointing out the counterplan's a terrible idea. They should get rewarded for disads to counterplan research and not disincentivized from that. Other kind of twist to think about is if you conceded topic disads, right? And the topic disads link to the plan and counterplan equally, that might mean a war with China is inevitable under both the counterplan and plan. And if a war with China is inevitable, that might take out a net benefit that avoids a slight war that then might escalate to China, right? And so cross applications from conceded disads, making it inevitable, or net benefits or Ks or things like that, sustainability, all those things can kind of be used to sort of bracket out impact wise as like impact defense to the few net benefits that you've tried to, or disads to counterplans that you've collapsed upon. Another big twist is going to be, when you have conceded, theory arguments. So, for example, if you have like no fiat on the K, and that's been conceded because you try to stick them to the counterplan, but no fiat means the app doesn't fiat, and reciprocally it means like the neg doesn't get counterplan fiat either. And so if neither the counterplan or app fiat, there's probably no politics net benefit or BizCon net benefit. So now there's no net benefit to either side. Which side gets presumption? Is it auto neg? Is it less change? Is it flips AF, right? And then that's what decides the debate because, no neg fiat / no fiat at all was conceded. And now you're in big trouble. And the judge is kind of making a coin flip type RFD. And so thinking about how you might have to answer some theory arguments on the K, even if you're trying to stick them on the counterplan, to make sure the arguments you have on the counterplan, that rely upon fiat are still there, so to speak. Vice versa, sustainability might be needed if you're going for an econ-based deficit to a counterplan. And so cross apps that are very obvious substantively you need to be on top of. Finally, you want to think about 2 NC counterplans. And so if you're a neg, you get the 2 NC counterplans, right? Now, these 2 NC counterplans might not be new worlds. So they're not like if you're stuck to one world, you might not be able to abandon that world, but why can't you, add a renovation, add an in addition, add another plank. And so that 2 NC plank could be just attached. You're never going to kick it. It's unconditionally a part of that one world, but you can use that kind to solve disads to counterplans. They say you use taxes for funding. You read a counterplan that doesn't raise taxes but does this other way to get funding through deficit spending. That's a plank additive thing to get out of it. Or you counterplan out of double turns. You counterplan out of uniqueness of the double turns to solve the scenario, or to make it fundamentally non-unique. And so there are ways a crafty 2N can get out of sort of these contradictions and dispo twists, where they're trying to call your all-in bluff, if you're crafty enough and willing to add these 2NC counterplans and justify it in the 2NC, obviously, with maybe a few arguments to say, look, we're still in the one counterplan. You've called us. We get the Goldilocks obvious additions. This forces sort of the best, most germane debate into the plan. They get these weird the counterplans additions are obvious, predictable because they're in prediction to their disadds to the counterplan that they picked to read. And so you might try to justify it with sort of that negflex Goldilocks story as well there. So outside of dispositionality, let's go ahead and talk about how you would answer it if you're AF. And so if you're AF, now you generally want to say the powerful argument is that the only works if the AF doesn't read perm or theory. So as long as you read counterplans that basically are guaranteed to solve the AF or be very dangerous for the AF to say, oh, I accept, then they're always going to perm or theory it, and you're always going to be in conditionality no matter what. And so dispo almost incentivizes these cheating, artificially competitive slop counterplans because the only legitimate AF response that's credible is going to be perm do CP or perm do other issues. And that's going to require theory debate as well on the counterplan being good or bad. And in that world, you're never really going to catch up to those infinite number of slop counterplans because when you get one caught up, it's still they're going to be able to debate it or they're never going to, it's still not going to be risky enough to kind of throw it there. And so the fundamental scenario is going to be a world of conditionality might be better because it doesn't encourage these types of cheating counterplans because that's not the condition and how you do it, but rather it's maybe based on number of worlds instead. Finally, you can have sort of like a education performative contradictions good type argument that we need to be able to have these contradictions to be able to test, to be able to get more risk averse 2Ns to test from different angles, to read Ks and counterplans, to be able to have these sort of more educationally diverse worlds. And so you can kind of weigh those standards on the neg educationally against them and try to control the education framing. Maybe you're weighing education versus their fairness, but maybe not. Vice versa, you're going to be using neg flexing, which is going to be your primary disad, and you're going to say this is too much far for them. They're going to call too much of a bluff. This discourages me from reading counterplans unless they're very, very long, and I'm never going to do that. And so it still tilts the Goldilocks far, far too much, and just try to control that basic structural impact calculus on where you are for the win percentage based on time and strategy skew. You can also kind of sort of hint at empirics. Now this is kind of improved, but you can kind of hint that even when it's dispo, the AF rarely calls the bluff. And so the reason why this is they're just never going to do that research themselves because they're lazy. And so it's still always going to be a perm counterplan debate no matter what. And dispo is like sort of a false theory sense of security. And if the negative says my interp's dispo, the AF's going to just say the opposite, dispo is bad and read theory no matter what. And so this is just more of an excuse to get to a theory interp than it is to really meet them halfway, offer this substantive compromise and really resolve their sort of research, bigger debating type thing. Because the neg's never going to research a long counterplan anyway, because the AF's never going to read these DAs anyway. They're just going to dispo's never going to go anywhere. Finally, with some judges, you can always make the argument hinted to above that dispo has different meanings. It's vague, it shifts, it's contradictory, you can force two worlds at once. All these sort of things that aren't super persuasive, but do work for minority judges, or at least something to put out there. Dispo is inherently illogical. Things like that are things that could be put out there and seen or just bought upon by a judge if dropped as sort of a TKO. Some key times and tips. So the general basic framework on how to do this is the 2AC is going to be short on condo. The neg block is going to be significantly longer, so it might not be super long, but it's going to have to at least have its offense. It's going to have to answer the standards that are extended. It's then going to have to answer the counterinterp specifically. And so those sort of 4 or 5 components together make up a longer block and response. Now, the 1AR has a choice. The 1AR can either not go for condo at all, and then they have a time win. 2AC versus 2NC, the neg had to spend more time. That's kind of their punishment for being conditional, is that little bitty time gain. And the 1AR says woohoo, and then just goes for normal substance. Vice versa, the 1AR goes for sort of the minimum amount of condo, which if you look at is much longer than the 2NC spent. That minimum amount is going to require them to not only extend their offense, they're then going to have to answer their opponent's offense. They're going to have to start weighing for the first time. They're then going to have to control sort of voting issues, framing, models, those types of things as well, and tell a complete story for the first time. And so any warrant you want the 2AR to have has to start in the 1AR, which is going to be a much, much more complete speech than the 2AC. And so it's going to be much, much longer to get to that sort of minimum required necessary. Now the 2NR in a key round is going to have to do the same, right? They have their baseline argument spat out, but they have not really done weighing. They haven't done comparisons, implications. They haven't really sold the story. They've just set up options. Now the 2NR has to go through the 1AR, which is a lot of new arguments as well, and they're going to have to line by each one of them. They're going to have their main offense. They're going to have to do comparative weighing, interp versus counter-interp. They're going to have to talk about models, what happened in these rounds, set up that for probable expectations of what's going to happen in the future. All those things are going to have happen speech-by-speech comparisons in a sort of more time. And so it's going to take more time to be credible in the 2NR, that minute 30 to 2 minutes almost, just to sort of make sure conditionality is covered. And then finally, the 2NR has the final choice. They get to either go none, and then they have a huge time benefit substance. They get to go all 5 minutes of substance versus the opponent's, 3 minutes or, 3:30, which is still a huge time gain. Or they say, you know what, no substance, I'm going all in on condo, and then they're going all in on condo versus the 1 minute and 20 max spent by the 2NR, and they get to really go slow, tell a story, tell the bout, point out key drops, and really win the debate. And so this is kind of the model that needs to be ingrained if you want to go for it. There are sort of deviations, but let's kind of talk about some key musts if you do this. Now, again, 1AR, 2NR, 2AR always have to have a complete speech. You always have to have that interp offense weighing, and then you have to get into defense, their standards, and basic voter stuff. There needs to be keyed line by line in-round application for all parts. And so the key sort of test is if you're pre-written blocks that are later speeches, 2NR, 2AR. If a majority of that speech is pre-written, the judge is probably not paying attention. You're mumbling through it. You're not going to go so well. So generally you take sort of the key core components that are pre-written and you're typing out the larger story. You're sort of massaging it into the round to make it seem textually specific with examples, wording, what actually was warranted in debates, going slow, delivering, all that stuff to kind of make it turn into a very, very good speech. That's what your time is spent doing. It needs to be there. One key rule with all this is, as you saw above, you're fundamentally, if you're going for it, you're always spending more time than the previous speech. This is something that goes bigger. It doesn't go less. If you're spending less than the opponent did, you've pretty much wasted your time and you're lowering your speaker points because it's not even credible and your time would be better spent sort of not going for it if you're AF. Vice versa, if you're neg, you're disrespecting them. If they must have screwed up something very specifically, and you better be right that they screwed up something specifically if you're spending way less than they did in a later speech. And so judge paradigms are another way to kind of influence this. A lot of judges will have absolute biases on condo, those infinite conditionality people, or how they approach judge kick or performed contradictions. Those types of things you kind of go through and sort of adapt from at all times. And so from there, you kind of want to think about some other sort of maybes, more strategy wisdoms, that strategic cross applications between sheets of paper, non-resolutional theory on sort of an A-spec argument might turn into something you use to get rid of condo bad, right? Because that's not based on the resolution. And so that's something as strategic application, or usually fairness versus education, reasonability, arguments on topicality could be used on conditional that we're reasonable because we only allow 2 worlds. And that's sort of what a more reasonable norm is in debate now. And so that's kind of things that you can think about to always make. Whether condo outweighs T. So most judges will say, no, it doesn't. T is a procedural. It's whether you're fair or not in the debate, and the debate should happen. They might also, outside of that jurisdictional arg, sort of give a reason that you being untopical forced the neg had no arguments to read that were applicable. They didn't do a case neg because they didn't predict it. And so instead they threw a bunch of slop at the wall. That's why they were conditional. And so thus topicality outweighs conditionality implicitly. And so if you're going to go for condo outweighs theory, it's very important you weigh it and usually have some sort of in-round argument about how either condo is a bigger norm to set than topicality is, or more specifically an in-round argument that the reason why, you lost the topicality debate is because you couldn't get to, your K of topicality, or you got spread out in the 1AR on one of the standards, or think our card comparison, because they had too many worlds in the block. And you need to make it seem in-round, seem like the condo really did time skew wise spill into topicality as a procedural. And so that's something that requires a lot of work, is the key nutshell. And you should rarely expect that to end up in a win, but sometimes it does. And you should definitely, if you're against it, not just assume topicality automatically outweighs conditionality. Vice versa, a little bit less likely, but also more threatening, would be condo versus other language Ks or microaggressions. So they're going for a K, but they've dropped condo, and we think easy win condo, but they've won that fiat as a microaggression, or the violence of you calling it the Arctic is frames geography in a colonialist way, and that's something that needs to be rejected on a discursive level and causes in-round violence in our representation that spills it over into everyday lives. And maybe that spillover is more important than what little bitty conditionality abuse that happened. And just because you read 8 worlds, you knew Arctic was the topic, it was predictable, you could have predicted this offense, and so, or you could predict your fiat because of should. And so, the number of worlds has nothing to do with that. And it's much, much better, maybe comparative spill up, to solve you on those language change than it is to change you on conditional worlds. And so you might get that threatening impact calculus the other way, and you have to kind of go and say, no, it's the number of worlds that caused us to do this. We had to test things that we weren't sure of, weren't prepared for. Of course, they're going to call us on one because they have a huge time advantage in researching it. We can't defend it because it wasn't predictable. That type of thing, you kind of have to spend a lot more. The other thing to kind of think about is, judge kick versus performative contradictions, and how all those sort of weigh against each other, and can you extend and get around those? That's always a key thing to play with. And then sort of course, dealing with, whether you're going to add that component as an additional standard with strategy skew, that component routes, or whether you're just going to abandon that and make sort of a traditional time skew based warrant, with DISPO and education. Fundamentally, collapsing into fairness or education. Now, sometimes you'll go into just one and everyone's all gone into like a fairness debate, and that's what it is, or an education debate, that's what it is. But usually it's going to kind of split between sides, and you'll have some comparative weighing between fairness and education. And it's very helpful to start usually 1AR, to have it at the very least, because if it's dropped 2NR, easy win 2AR, and the 2NRs usually got to kind of pick opposite weighing to kind of cover their bases, because if dropped 2AR, easy neg winning, or at least establishes how much you have to win on your standard. And so this is all super important, but you can always sometimes collapse into fairness or education. So let's talk about some condo 1ARs. And so condo 1ARs, let's talk about sort of the progression of just sort of how debate looks, good debate to bad debate. So the troll bad worst case scenarios, I've hidden my 5-second condo blip on case, on A-spec, whatever. The negative block drops it. The 1AR extends it for 15 seconds. I either win the debate because GG there, or the 2NR gets up and says, you silly troll, you should actually read this on the counterplan or a K-alt and not hide it in the doc and not be a coward and not lie to me when I asked you to cross-X what were the direct T-margs and you didn't say condo. And then the 2AR gets up and whines about tech versus truth and they should flow better. And then the judge is very mad at both sides and, might vote neg in that scenario and say, well, you lied and cross. And so that sort of troll scenario is you'll see a lot in low levels. You'll see it in mid levels. You might even see it occasionally in high levels. It's something I would definitely avoid and just get good at asking and cross, and then good at sort of avoiding this sort of bad norm of debate. The sort of novice basic test is where, yes, you've read in the 2AC, the neg has sort of identified it, they've read their block. Now the 1AR gets up and all they basically do is reread their 2AC. So they've explicitly extended their 2AC, which maybe implicitly answers some of the neg block, but they've dropped all these things. There's no real line by line. They just sort of extended through ink. And so this is very novice oriented, because if the neg gets up and, they're hoping basically that the neg drops it. They went through this real quickly. It's not in the doc. They reread the speech. They mumbled through it. The neg's too busy prepping this other argument. They think they've won the disad, and they've now dropped condo in the 1AR. And the 2AR gets up and says, haha, you dropped condo. The judge is now sad because the neg didn't realize this, but the judge is probably voting AF because, this is novice and the neg should have definitely flowed condo in the 1AR, even if they dropped all the neg responses. Now we get to that JV level. The neg has now figured this out. They have now figured out the condo is in there, and so they've started to respond to it and point out the drops. And so now the minimum amount necessary for that team to win is they have to now spend more and answer all the 2NC arguments. So they're extending it, line by lining it, all of that. The JV team spending more. And now we're in the world where the 2NR, now they're not used to a 1 minute 30 1AR in condo, and they're just getting up and basically re-extending the 2NC through ink. They're not really line by lining the 1AR. They're not really weighing. They're just getting up and being like, oh crap, I'm just used to them extending and not doing anything. I'm just used to just extending drops, but now nothing's been dropped. And so I'm just going to extend everything and hope the judge is going to gut check for me. And in this world, that's a scenario where the app gets up and does a full condo speech, says you've disrespected me. You've not understood the basics of condo. You've dropped all these responses. Easy, clean half ballot. The judge is happy. They're willing to sort of educate them into that varsity lesson of what a proper speech is. In the good varsity debater, it starts to get to the world and where the 1AR is that more speech. Now the varsity person's respectful. They have their equal amount of time, at the very least, sometimes a little bit more if they have to do more weighing. And now the 2AR has an option. The 2AR either spends no time in it, which gives them the huge advantage, probably makes the judge a little bit happier because there's no real condo debate. Everyone respected each other, and it's a normal substantive debate that's probably not super big because we can kick out of some theory arguments. It's easier to resolve. It's a 20-minute decision, not a 30-minute decision of card reading. Vice versa, the varsity person goes all in on condo in that 2AR. The judge is probably indifferent. Now an equal condo debate, where everyone's sort of respectful for each other. The neg probably has a side bias, and so the neg might be winning this round. So it's something that the app's probably very unlikely to do unless if there's really no other way option, and that's their best chance. Now again, we get to that sort of TOC level where the neg block's very good. And so here the app has decided I have a better chance if I can just win more substance, because I'm never really going to get to that 2AR of going for it. And they're definitely going to give a good 2NR on it. And so the time gain I get on 2AR versus 2NR is less valuable than the time gain I'm going to get 1AR versus neg block. So instead, in the 1AR, I'm just not going to do condo at all. I'm going to go for a second solvency deficit on the counter plan. I'm going to go for a second no internal link on the disad net benefit. And I'm going to have a much better 2AR options on substance and a more holistic speech there than if I just force condo for a set number of time because it's easy. And so it might be harder to prep. It might be harder to execute, but it's a higher win percentage. And so that's the debate I end up going to. But no, you're not really starting here because that's usually harder to do. And so being very good at condo is a very easy way to both win debates, and being very bad at condo on the neg is a very easy way to lose debates. It's also sort of helpful, the more off case to get, the easier it is for condo to help out. So we talked about that sort of baseline condo and where you kind of want to be, and that's all sort of important. So it's important that you're spending that minimum 1AR time, 115, etc., that you might have minimal responses on other parts of the debates, but it's relatively easy to prep. It splits the 2NR into two worlds, which gives the 2AR an easy prep trade-off. However, you have limited substantive options. If you make one mistake on one world, it's GG, whereas if you're going for two substantive options, if you lose one, you still have another option. And so you also might be hurting your speaks a little bit if you're going just condo 1ARs relative to an actual substantive strong. You might put yourself into judge bias issues where you think you're winning condo, but the judge is against you, and you end up losing the debate even though you think you won on the flow. And so that's kind of the risk-reward calculus you need for conditionality 1ARs. For the 2NRs, so again, for this, you want to start with your interp offense, weighing, defense standards, all the voting issues, impact cal, things like that. Now, of course, for each part of the debate, everything needs to be comparative with interp. So as you extend your offense, why does your interp solve education relative to their counter interp of dispo? Not relative to one less world, not relative to zero worlds. That pure Goldilocks scenario needs to be specific to interps. And so you might be taking some of your answers to their interp in the block and incorporating that into some of the relative weighing to kind of win your core offensive standard or win their turn or defense to one of their standards. And so for each part of the debate, you're going to be definitely comparing interps throughout. Finally, in-round versus model. So again, in-round abuse could establish what the relative probability of happens in the real world is, not what hypothetically could happen. Vice versa, what happened here is not necessarily what always happens in the real world. And so allowing these other things could be very, very bad. We might want to limit those. Now, if you're neg, you obviously want to be making it seem like the opponent wasted their own time and strategy. Like, it's not like you forced them into this world. They read the wrong counterinterp on T, or they forgot to make the perm on the counterplan. They read the wrong solvency deficit. They dropped a disad because they read 3 link turns on politics instead of 1. They read 3 new cards on case, right? All of these things are things the app did themselves to shoot them in the foot. Me reading a second counterplan is not what caused the time skew. It's not what strategically limited them. They didn't have that disad to counterplan to read on the counterplan. They lost because the counterplan just solved the case better. And so this is kind of the framing you want to kind of make to kind of talk about in round. So even if it's a model-based scenario, to say, look, this is a low probability type thing. In reality, what's happening here is what's much more likely going to happen. Neg flex is a standard impact calculus. Always important. Your offense is neg flex. And, you can always use this as impact calculus. Worst comes to worst. It's better to punish them, even if they're right, and it hurts their ground. That's a good thing. And so usually this is all structural versus topic stuff. It's better to have topic-based stuff. The worlds of things, you start with structure. It can frame everything if dropped, but in equalness, the judge usually then goes to topics. Topics might be a better application of how structures work, but in equalness, you might go for what's actually happening in rounds, looking at elims and bid level data and things like that. And so all those different levels require more specificity, and you kind of just sort of tell the story. The 2NR is very important here to kind of establish it's either here or never, because you know for sure if the 2AR is going for this, it's going to be a little bit new, and so you better want to start to hedge that now, and at least win this core standard. Think of sort of ways out as well. So if you're losing condo, go for T. If you're losing condo, try to establish a K, sort of language-based K type argument or a microaggression to outweigh condo. If you're going for a, status quo disad, establish judge kick and say condo's not a voter, non-resolutional theory, something like that, to be able to get a conceded disad, status quo route to win the debate. Even if all the counterplans go away, that could be a sufficient remedy. And get rid of, 6 of the counterplans has no justification why they couldn't win case. It was at the top of the 2AC order, The disad was something they can always outweigh, right? And so they just had bad time allocation. And so that's something that could maybe be a better frame or application of judge kick. And so very, very important to kind of think about that. Now let's talk about condos in the 2AR. So again, basic, always remember, rarely are you going for condo in the 2AR. Even if you're always putting it in the 2AC, you might usually be putting in the 1AR because it's a good model to learn in varsity, but it's rare you're going for it in the 2AR. Now, usually there's like 3 ways in which condo is ever going to happen in the 2AR that are acceptable post-round to come to me and say, I went for condo. Either A, everything else was going wrong, or something else went super wrong, and we had to go for condo. Okay? That'll happen. That happens, acceptable, win for condo. Maybe you lost, but sometimes a 10% win percentage is better than a 0% win percentage, and you take your shot. The story is not go for condo. The story is win those other positions, but condo is an acceptable backup option, the Hail Mary, so to speak. The other acceptable condo is, they dropped it or they fundamentally disrespected you by screwing it up so badly. And we've talked about those scenarios where they've spent less time than you did. They've dropped the standard. They dropped weighing, right? They didn't frontline your responses. And so in those scenarios where you just have to sort of call them and say, I'm a better theory debater and go for condo, that is an acceptable condo 2AR. Vice versa, the final condo scenario is they fundamentally broke the game. They got up and said double digit off case. And the judge is someone that's, older than 25, cares about pedagogy, and is willing to not put up with this nonsense and just vote on condo. And then the bias for condo sort of shifted. And you're going to find yourself winning implicitly a lot of arguments in equal debates. And so you can sort of tell that in-round abuse a lot better, the time skew a lot better, the strat skew a lot better when there's all those sort of contradictory worlds, things like that. And so this is something to kind of think about as well, sort of the third acceptable condo scenario. Now, big tips for condo 2ARs. Now, the big overarching theme is you have those 300 seconds basically versus 120 seconds. Now, this condo 2AR is relative to, substance. If you're doing case T, you probably are still, either going for T enough, trying to say T is close enough and condo outweighs in-round abuse, or you're going all in on T, or you're going all in condo. Rarely my biggest suggestion would be just go for T, but the more common condo scenario is condo versus counterplans or condo versus substance. And so these worlds where you have a huge time advantage because the 2-R, even a respectful one, maxed at like 120. And so you got all 5 minutes, 300 seconds. And so the biggest suggestions: go slow, don't spread, be repetitive, stumble, tell an organized story. Think of it like an overarching theme. Tell A subpoint, B subpoint, go through it. Package everything on the flow in 1AR language. Go through the flow starting with what the first 1AR said, extend it, use their language to make new implications, new warrants, frame it within their wording to make it seem not new. As long as the judge can tie it a little bit to the 1AR, it's not going to be new, and now you can use it to punish the 2-R. Vice versa, you want to kind of tie everything together, go speech by speech. We started here, they said this, we responded this, they dropped it here because of this means. You want to be able to execute that out, that basic decision calculus by the judge, and so you've basically wrote their ballot for them. You want to kind of do the whole pull the rug under the 2-R, so identify a tiny little drop. Point it out on the flow. Make sure it's there and the judge knows it was there and it was a drop that was warranted, a complete argument. Now implicate it and make it unravel the round. Make it take out all their arguments. Make it form an independent win condition. All those things can be done to sort of pull the rug from under the 2-R in condo debates. You can resolve sort of key nexus questions with sort of larger warrants, datas, and truths. Both teams might have got to a tie in earlier speeches that are irresolvable. And right now it's up to a judge coin flip or bias. And maybe you can win by just sort of out debating them in the 2-AR by giving more warranting. And yes, it might be slightly new, but it's better that the judge votes for a team that gave a warrant than neither team that did. And so maybe your slightly new is above that threshold, or it's inherently true the judge be biased toward you and the judge is willing to go there. And so, or the judge is willing to say they're going to cut out more of the 2-R, because yes, the 2-AR is too new, but so is the 2-R in a lot of parts, and now it's an easier app ballot on sort of a minimalistic route. And so being able to control those, resolve those larger questions, and when the truth of debate is essential, is you should never have lost the truth of debate. You might lose a condo 2-R on too new, but you should never sort of lose a condo 2-R on, you just lost. You should want to usually establish in-round abuse as a probable outcome of models claims. We've talked this about as well. The more in-round things you can talk about are what got you where you were. The reason why you couldn't get to the solvency deficit on the counterplan is because you had 3 other counterplans to answer with different solvency deficit type stories that they had fiated over the probable deficit, so required 2 additional cards to answer those added planks. That world of additional time skew might have made it to where you dropped one or dropped a net benefit or something like that. And so that scenario is one, or you couldn't get to an actual link turn on a disad and had to sacrifice that, and now risk of the scenario where you're in trouble. And so that's a scenario where you might be weighing those various claims to establish in-round abuse as actually what happened here is actually indicative of them taking to the stream did actually really happen. Again, everything went Goldilocks. Everything's never extreme. One side always wins, but rather trying to find what's good for best debates and why your interp is closer to that best spot. And so that comes from those global sort of fairness, structural topic, database claims and trying to always be comparative inter versus counter interp. And so moral of the story is you got to do these speeches a few times. The blocks are usually the 2NC has a block, the 2NC has a blocks. The 1AR has blocks that are pre-written. Now 2NR, 2AR is usually up to you as a debater to have your own version, spins, you're in your own voice. And so usually there you don't want to be using other people's blocks. You want to kind of use the pre-written stuff to write your own. And then you want to be able to practice executing those speeches by having like a 50% template that's pre-written and then being able to type up stuff with those 3-4 minutes of prep you have to kind of sell it the one way, whether you're a 2AR, 2NR, to kind of execute it as you need. And so this is an important sort of conditionality lecture because when you're young, it's a very easy way to both win and lose debates. And so that's something that's a very core skill to get used to and to get good at. And that's something that we're trying to institutionalize with this video lecture here. So hopefully this was helpful.